Okay, well again, thank you for your participation and for being here today. We are running behind, but first up we have, I'm probably going to butcher this poor guy's name, Gielczyk?
Gielczyk, yeah.
Gielczyk, okay, Ben Gielczyk, who has been with the House Fiscal Agency since 2008 and currently serves as the agency's Associate Director and Senior Economist. And we've asked Ben to come in and give a state budget overview for you right on the cusp of the subcommittee hearings that are taking place and as we move directly into the budget season. So Ben?
Woo! Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out, and thanks to Arnold for inviting me to present here for you. Like I said, I'm Ben Gielczyk. I'm an Associate Director with the House Fiscal Agency, and I've been there since 2008. I do apologize this morning. I'm still getting over a cold about a week and a half ago, so my voice kind of comes and goes. If you wanted me to come and speak on the state budget, which is basically covers every policy issue that anyone in here covers, I figured the best way to do that would be to touch briefly on the process, sort of what it looks like in the coming months and weeks. Then I'll sort of set a baseline for you, going over the current year budget and some historical trends that will sort of set up the fiscal year 25 executive recommendation highlights that I wanted to talk about. So starting with the budget process, just a bit of self-promotion. Like I said, I'm with the House Fiscal Agency. We have agency personnel that provide confidential and nonpartisan expertise. We comprise fiscal analysts, economists, and legislative analysts. We have a sister agency in the Senate. I see one member of the Senate Fiscal Agency over there, Bruce. Good morning. I've worked, the first 12 years of my career with the Fiscal Agency, I was in the fiscal analyst portion. I've now moved on to economic and revenue forecasting and tax policy, so fall under the economist bullet there. And we have legislative analysts, which I'm sure you've dealt with on a regular basis, maybe not personally, but all legislation that goes through a standing committee does receive a legislative analysis on it, and our legislative analysts cover that portion. I won't read all the bullets, other than to note that as our fiscal analysts do serve an integral role in budget deliberations as they proceed in the budget drafting process. So just to briefly go through Michigan's budget process, I'll start up in that right-hand 1 o'clock sort of time there in the shaded box with the first revenue estimating conference. We had that in January. It's established in statute of the second week of January. That establishes an updated revenue estimate for the current fiscal year and the subsequent 2 fiscal years. So it basically establishes the revenues. The governor will set her budget recommendation on, and the House and Senate when they put out their budget recommendations as well. In early February, that's when the governor must release a executive recommendation. We've passed that down. We are right at about 3 o'clock in the subcommittee deliberation. So over the next couple months, we've probably been in it about 3-4 weeks now, and have another half a month or so of subcommittee deliberations. These are where subcommittees bring in departments, other interested parties, stakeholders to talk about budget asks, budget revisions from the exec rec, new programs they want, anything like that. So those programs that process is happening right now. Leadership within the House and Senate established targets, which are basically dollar amounts for each budget. So when the subcommittees decide to report those out, they do have guardrails set up on how much they have to work within each individual budget. So when they come out of subcommittee, moving down, they'll go to the standing committee, the House Appropriations Committee. Again, receive a couple days of hearings there as we go through each budget, and then receive floor action like all legislation must. The House and Senate sort of send their bills to each other, and the process recently has been a non-concurrence, basically to send all of the bills to conference committee for final deliberations in May and June. In May, we're required to have a second revenue estimating conference, which basically provides updated amounts or updated revenue estimates from the first consensus revenue estimating conference with any new data over those few months that we've had. And this basically establishes those revenue estimates that we build the final fiscal year, in this case 25 budget on. And everybody everybody concurs that's participated in by the House Fiscal Agency, Senate Fiscal Agency, and the administration. So once those are Those revenue estimates are concurred in. The leadership in the House, Senate, and Governor's office will come together to establish targets. You can see that it's about 8 o'clock there in the chart that I've got before you. Once they've established targets for each individual budget, sort of like they did in the House and Senate recommendation process, the conference committees will use those guardrails to deliberate and settle on final budgets for each department. And those will again go through conference committee, not subject to amendment. Those usually quickly move, sometimes within the same day, from conference committee to floor action. You'll see, and once they're sent to the governor does have a line item veto, so usually signs within a couple weeks, but those 2 weeks will be reviewing the budget, deciding where she wants to make a line item veto, if there are any. That sort of ends the major legislative push, and that usually, at least in the last 5 or 6 years, has happened in June. We as an agency and the Senate Fiscal Agency put out reports, we review the budget throughout the year, prepare for the next budget in those following months, and there's always supplemental and transfer recommendations. Supplementals can be positive or negative. Those are adjustments based on maybe some revenue information we have throughout the fiscal year, new programs that want to be added. Again, those need legislative buy-in. Same thing with transfers. Those are transfers between lines. Departments will often come to us throughout the year on a fairly set schedule to establish that they want to move funds from one line to the next. And again, that needs legislative approval. So that's sort of a high-level look at the state budget process. Just setting the baseline on the state budget overview, so some key terms. Fiscal year, I don't know if you know that, the state fiscal year runs from October to September, October 1 to September 30th. Within a budget, we have appropriations. These are authority to spend funds. They're not actual amounts. So if it says Department of Treasury, $50 million, you can spend up to $50 million. You're not required to spend $50 million, and that's indicated in a line item. There are boilerplate, that's a lot of text in the bill. If you've ever opened up a budget bill, that's just conditions on those funds that may say you may not spend this money on X, or you must spend X amount on Y. And then, like I said, since the appropriations are authority to spend funds, any funds that aren't spent in a fiscal year, we do see lapses, and those can sometimes be significant. So the fiscal year 24 budget is about $80.7 billion. You can see the fund sources there. Federal revenues are restricted for a federal purpose, identified usually within the funding stream with very little discretion from the legislature. Local and private revenues are a very small piece of the budget. Local revenues would be something like Treasury, providing city income tax services for cities that sign up. They basically can capture a portion of the city income tax revenue, which is otherwise locally allocated, to pay for those services. And private revenues, things such as private donations for maybe like license plate fundraising type stuff. They get some private donations in that piece as well. State restricted funds are restricted by the state constitution or statute. So think something like a fee you pay for a park that is statutorily dedicated to park improvements. We, outside of changing the statute, the legislature is required to spend those funds as the statute or constitution says it must. And I will note that of the $31.9 billion there, about over $19 billion of that is school aid fund restricted for education. The general fund, general purpose, is the discretionary state funds, and the legislature can generally appropriate this source of funds however it sees fit. And one note, just general fund and school aid fund are really the primary focus of budget negotiations that I talked about. The next few slides are just a high-level look at how we distribute funds within that $80.7 billion budget. About 44% is health and human services, with a vast majority of that being for Medicaid. School aid makes up about 27%, and my rough math is right, between healthcare and education, that's basically takes up about 75% of overall of the $80 billion budget. On a general fund basis, general fund totaled $15.3 billion, as a slide a couple earlier indicated. Again, health and human services is the vast majority of it at 42%. Again, about $4 billion, just over $4 billion of that budget for health and human services is for state Medicaid. Corrections is the next, and then on down the line you can see how those appropriations play out. School aid fund isn't entirely used for K-12, but K-12 does receive about 95% of available funding. Community colleges, which are entirely funded by school aid, and universities split the remaining 5% there. In higher education, the university portion is not 100% of university funding, it is a smaller sliver. Just about 1/2 of the school aid budget is dedicated to foundation allowances, and these are the per pupil amounts established each year and distributed to districts for operations. MIPSR's pension payments, the state share, are the next largest payment in the school aid budget. You can see they're at $2.5 billion, or about 12%. Again, you can see some of the other programs that are funded through school aid, but like I said, the vast majority is for foundation allowances. Noting some budget trends, basically talking about some history. So $80 billion budget, how does it compare to prior years? Well, you can certainly see we're at a nominal high point. I started in 2008, which is just off on the left side there, and you can see that the total state budget was under $50 billion. In the last few years, we've been over $80 billion. As you would expect, the theme going forward across a number of these historical slides will be COVID's impact on the state budget. Starting in about fiscal year 20 through basically up until 24, significant federal funds have boosted the overall state budget, but there have also been some economic conditions that have generated significant increases in revenues. Think boosts in income tax, both personal and corporate, as wages have improved, sales and use tax revenue if people bought a ton of goods, I'm sure you've read about in the news. That is all, and inflation has been baked into a lot of this. So that all flows through to the state revenue picture, and you can see along the bottom there, general fund certainly has risen in the last few years. Same thing with our restricted funds on the school aid side. Despite strong growth in the size of the budget, however, the number of state employees has not grown. It has remained relatively level for the past 5 to 10 years. As the slide notes, the total number of state employees has actually dropped 33% since 2001. With about half of that drop due to corrections employer reductions, and that's mainly due to a steady decline in the prisoner population. From a dollar perspective, total employee costs are about $6.5 billion, or gross $3.4 billion general fund, and on a gross basis, that's about 8% of that $80 billion budget, and just over 20% of the general fund budget make up employee costs. I highlight Medicaid expenditures because there's significant cost pressure on the state budget, and just remember that DHHS receives over 40% of the general fund expenditures, and this is a significant reason why here. Caseloads have increased due to Medicaid expansion, that's that first orange line on the left there, Healthy Michigan Plan introduced, and then a freeze on redeterminations of Medicaid eligibility during COVID, and that's the second line, so you can see that green caseload number kind of rise post both of those, getting a little extra bump in both instances. As recent headlines have noted, the redetermination process is ongoing and the caseloads are expected to drop fairly significantly. They have exceeded some of our estimates. This should, I think, soften some of the pressure on the budget, but the healthcare costs are still a big driver even with smaller caseloads. If you work for a legislature, as I assume you all do, you're impacted by revenue sharing. City, village, and township revenue sharing consists of 2 parts. Constitutional and the textured light blue amount on the bottom, those bottom bars. That amount is basically 15% of the sales tax revenue collected at the 4% rate. And I know the sales tax is 6%, but the top 2% of the sales tax is completely dedicated to school aid. All CVTs, all cities, villages, and townships receive a portion of the constitutional amount based on their population. The bold bars on top represent statutory revenue sharing, and this is completely discretionary on the part of the legislature. It's currently available to a subset of units, about 650 currently, based on legislatively established language in the bill. I think the takeaway from this slide is that while there have been regular increases to the statutory component in recent years, constitutional revenue sharing has certainly been responsible for most of the overall increase in revenue sharing when you combine the 2 bars there. Basically driven by significant growth in the sales tax that I talked about post-COVID, or during COVID and post-COVID. County revenue sharing differs from CVT revenue sharing in that it doesn't have a constitutionally required component. So this is all discretionary funding. The history of county revenue sharing over the past 20 years is a little more complex than the CVT revenue sharing, as this chart sort of indicates in some of the different shadings and whatnot. I'm not going to go into that here because that would take another 15 minutes or so, but feel free to reach out if you have questions about county revenue sharing. Happy to walk you through some of that history if constituents ask or a member ask. Generally speaking, counties have been receiving revenue sharing increases commensurate with CVT revenue sharing increases for the last decade or so. Counties currently receive about 117% of full funding amount provided for in statute. University operations grants provide general support for university operations. We're currently at a nominal 20-year high in the current fiscal year. As this chart indicates, you might ask what happened in 2012. That's sort of that dip, and then we start to get some of that shaded coloring there, just for a point of reference. There was a tax change. We moved to a corporate income tax that reduced taxes on most businesses. Since the CIT, the newly implemented CIT, only applied to C corporations. This reduced available general fund. I will note that it wasn't terribly evident in the prior slides, but just basically because of scale, but revenue sharing was also reduced in fiscal year 22 by about a third. University operations were reduced about 15% in fiscal year 2012, and some school aid fund indicated in the light blue textured bar, like I said, was allocated to support operations grants, which has been carried forward. And you can see, I think in 21 is when we finally crossed the threshold of that 2012, or what it was in 2011 prior to the 2012 reduction. Community college appropriations were spared the larger cuts in fiscal year 2012, but a big change happened in that we started to fund a significant portion of their budget with school aid. That was not the case prior to fiscal year 2010. Today it is entirely funded with school aid. Differentiation there is, again, the solid bars represent general fund, the sort of shaded light blue bars are the school aid components, so you can see that change. Community college increases in recent years have more or less mirrored university increases. That's evident in the light blue textured box showing the growth. The green textured portion at the top, reflects the state share of pension costs required under legislation enacted in 2012. That capped the employer or community college contribution at 20.96% of payroll, and then the state is responsible for the rest. So that green represents the state share of pension costs for community colleges, since they participate in the public school employee retirement system. School aid funding has increased steadily since fiscal year 2010, increasing by a total of 52%. The impact of COVID boosting sales tax receipts is evident in those final few years there in the chart. As you can see, the increases really started to accelerate after fiscal year 2020. Like I noted with community colleges, retirement changes in 2012 put a cap on the school's share of retirement costs, and the blue bars indicate how these costs have grown. Much of that growth is due to retirement revisions, making certain assumptions more conservative within the system, which necessitate larger payments. So you can see some of that, those blue bars along the top start to grow in the as we move to the fiscal year 24. Highlighting MIPSR's retirement liabilities. MIPSR is by far the state's largest pension system. In this chart, pension liabilities are in blue and retiree health care is in green. First, the pension liability trend, and it may not look like we're making much progress. As you can see those numbers, each bar kind of shows an increase. However, I would argue that we are in a much better financial position today than we were just 5 or 10 years ago. One note, pensions are not mortgages with a fixed principal. Rather, the liability within a pension can change based on financial assumptions and experience of the system around mortality and retirement age, those types of things. So core assumptions within the system have been adjusted to better reflect reality. Things like the assumed rate of return on the system have come down, the assumed assumption around payroll growth has been reduced, and dollar funding floor from one year to the next has been adopted. So when you add these when you make these assumptions more conservative, they increase the liability on paper and the amount we contribute to the system on an annual basis. But they better reflect reality of what the system is experiencing. The pension liability is still on track to be retired in 2038, and we continue to meet and even exceed in some years our required payments within the pension system. On the health side, you can see how these changes have helped significantly reduce the liability since we started pre-funding retiree health care in fiscal year 2012. It's not in this chart, but I can tell you that we are set to achieve fully funded status on MIPSR's retiree health care in the next valuation, which would be fiscal year 23, which is well ahead of the original schedule set out when we first started pre-funding retiree health care. In the most recent valuation in the far right bar, barely perceptible in green on top of that blue bar. Retiree healthcare was about 99.2% funded in that fiscal year 22 evaluation. And I'll talk a little bit about this when we get to the executive recommendation. I'll just note that retiree healthcare portion of MIPSRS is where the exec rec assumes $680 million in MIPSRS savings that's been reported with some regularity that has now been put to other school aid purposes. Transportation funding really started to increase in fiscal year 2017 after the enactment of the 2015 road funding package. A steadily higher amount of general fund has been dedicated to transportation, capping out at about $600 million it receives today, and that's evident in the growth in the blue bars. Growth in the gas tax rate has also helped those recent gains. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, enacted at the end of 21, enhanced federal distributions of the states, and you can see that increase in the larger green bars beginning in 22. This slide provides a brief history of the state's rainy day fund. The bold numbers, or the bold bars, are actual, and the textured represent our estimates from CREC. We anticipate the fund will cross the $2 billion threshold in fiscal year 25. Steady deposits since fiscal year 2012 have grown the fund to its current nominal high. The current high interest rate environment has also helped boost revenues to the fund. Interest earnings are approaching almost $100 million a year. If you went back 5 years, let's say, we were making less than $10 million a year in interest. And yes, the principal was less, but interest rates have moved from sub 1% to 4 to 5%. So that makes a real difference when we talk about interest earnings. I include this slide just to highlight the craziness of the pandemic, mainly around revenue estimating. So these are ending balances at the end of the year, sort of what revenue were left over based on net appropriations, once we've factored out the appropriations. So budgets are built on estimates, and if you paid any attention to our consensus estimating conferences during the pandemic, you would know that we were underestimating revenues by over $1 billion and sometimes billions of dollars fairly regularly. With the help of significant rapid increases in revenues that were above projections and significant sums of federal recovery dollars, you end up with historically high fund balances as evidence that are starting in fiscal year 21. We don't expect those to continue. As you see in the shaded bars, they'll start to come down. Those are still historic highs, but they're starting to come down. But there was a time when we were sitting on significant sums of money. In 22, I think we had combined balances of almost $14 billion, which basically matches the one-year general fund. This should also serve as a reminder that the COVID and early post-COVID years are not normal. As you can see, going back for 20 years prior to COVID, we had ending balances well below $1 billion often. So revenue trends, I just wanted to include the next couple of slides for context when we talk about recent revenue growth. Even with the big gains in general fund revenue in recent years, you can see on a real inflation adjusted basis that we're still over 25% below the fiscal year 2000 level. School aid has fared a little better in real terms, slightly above the fiscal year 2000 level, but it only reached that point in fiscal year 21. One of the main reasons that it has fared better is that it is often shielded from various tax changes, where the general fund is not, making the general fund a little more volatile. This just shows our most recent January 24 forecast, correct forecast for 24, 25, and 26. In a quick summary, it's really a general return to prior trends of moderate growth. We'll note in fiscal year 26, there, that sort of middle section, we do show 4.9% growth in general fund, which would be above trend. However, that is inflated a little bit because we have $550 million in earmarks, primarily for the SOAR fund, from the corporate income tax expiring and returning to the general fund. So that sort of sets the base for fiscal year 25 executive recommendation highlights I want to talk about. I'm going to touch on some of the very high level pieces of this. Beginning balances for fiscal year 24 and 25 have both grown with the January CREC estimates. We revised 23 general fund up by $178 million and school aid fund up by about $118 million, and fiscal year 24 general fund up by $360 million and school aid fund up by almost $60 million. There were also lapses of fiscal year 23 funds that we were recently notified about. Again, those are 23 funds. We're now halfway through the fiscal year 24 year, but 24 wasn't built on identified lapses, so those show up as new money available for fiscal year 24 or 25. Those total just over $1 billion general fund and $150 million school aid fund. This shows the executive recommendation compared to the enacted budget. The exec rec for fiscal year 25 is about 0.4% larger than fiscal year 24 on an adjusted gross basis. There's a relatively large 5.8% drop in the general fund, mainly due to elimination of some one-time funding because we don't have similar starting balances available. A large portion of the one-time funding was from LEO enhancement grants, so we do, I think, over 100 individual grants for things like maybe a new water tower or a fire truck. Those types of things get included in the budget, and I think those exceeded $1 billion in the current year budget. And there was a significant deposit into the Make It in Michigan fund, which deals with drawing down federal matches, and that is going away. Remember, this is just a proposal to start the process, the executive rec, that is. The legislature is free to appropriate how it sees fit in its own proposals, and it is not limited to solely respond to what the exec rec has done. It's not taking it line by line and saying yes or no. It can start basically from a zero balance. One last note, it's not highlighted anywhere in these slides, but there were some supplemental recommendations, which is typical with an executive recommendation for the current fiscal year. Those totaled about $1.8 billion, and those dealt with a lot of caseload adjustments post-January CREC, and it included $150 million for the reopening of the Palisades nuclear plant. There are three types of adjustments I will go over. Current services baseline, like this slide shows. Just think inflationary adjustments, contractual adjustments, caseload adjustments. There are ongoing funding adjustments, things like new programs and enhanced programs. This also assumes that those ongoing funding adjustments assume that based on balance sheet and revenue picture that the adjustments can be maintained in future fiscal years. And then we have one-time adjustments, and these are allocations for one-off programs, grants, etc., without an intention for them to continue in future fiscal years. So looking at current services baseline assumption, just noting a couple things. There's $229.2 million added for caseload adjustments, mainly in DHHS for Medicaid and MDE for child care. There was $128 million general fund for state employee compensation related costs, mainly around a contractual 5% increase to salaries and wages, and $135 million for all other CSBs, things like Medicare buy-in compliance, prisoner health care and nursing contracts, and indigent defense commission grants and veterans homes operations. Ongoing allocations totaled $437.6 million in the executive recommendation, $214.8 million for existing program increases and new programs within DHHS, and those are listed below there. Some community behavioral health, child care institution rates, Michigan Energy Assistance Program, and non-direct care wage increases. There was $112.5 million increase for university operations, which represented a 2.5% increase. Some increases for scholarships within higher ed, $37.9 million, $19 million GF to increase hourly child care reimbursement rates by 10%, and then $12.9 million for the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission for implementations of standards 6 and 7. Moving on to one-time allocations, those totaled $769.3 million general fund and exec rec, $185 million in transportation, a large portion of that for federal match, and about $55 million for local bridge and culvert projects, one-time culvert projects. $131 million in labor and economic opportunity, $25 million for development-ready sites, $20 million to enhance the existing business attraction and community revitalization program, which is currently at $100 million. That would bump it up to $120 million. $20 million for Going Pro, which is employee training, and $20 million for workforce needs. There's $90 million in Eagle, again $40 million for federal match there, and $25 million for electric vehicle charging station grants throughout the state. $77.6 million in DHHS. You can see $14.2 million for family planning grants and a nursing loan repayment program proposed for $10 million. $76.8 million in DTMB. There's $31.5 million for a flexible spending account state match related to employee care services, and a Make It in Michigan deposit of $25 million. $60 million in MyLeap, the newly created MyLeap program to provide child care subsidies for child care workers. And lastly, there's a $100 million deposit in the budget stabilization fund. Just to highlight a few education funding components, there was $316 million to increase district foundation allowances by $241 per pupil, or a 2.5% increase. There was 27 million in savings in the school aid budget, recognized by reducing cyber school foundation allowances to 80% of the overall foundation allowance. It continues 300 million of per pupil mental health and school safety grants. And again, down the line, I won't go through each one of those, but last point there is that community colleges also received a 2.5% increase, and that was totaled about $9 million. MIPSR's changes, I briefly discussed this earlier. The school aid budget assumes early realization of MIPSR's OPEB healthcare system savings. This would require a statutory change because statute currently has a funding floor in years where the system is not 100% funded. So even though the most recent valuation shows the system funded at 99.2%, that would still subject it to the floor. So the exec rec proposes removing the floor and just paying the required contribution for fiscal year 25, which would free up that $675.4 million. Otherwise, that would otherwise be dedicated to MIPSR's retiree health care. Without the statutory change, we do expect the savings to be realized in fiscal year 26, once the system does show it's 100% funded in the fiscal year 23 valuation. So, like I said, that needs a statutory change, and certainly at this point, unsure how that will get, or if it will get immediate effect or not, and how that impacts the budget going forward is unclear. The exec rec also proposes to save districts about $100 million via change to the payroll contribution floor from 20.96 to 20% even. This would not change the amount that we contribute to MIPSR's in any given year, but just shift those costs to the state from the schools, generating additional savings for schools. Revenue sharing allocations, all CBTs and counties are receiving a 5% ongoing increase to their revenue sharing, and there is also 5% proposed for a one-time increase for CBTs and counties. Of the 5%, 2% is to support local public safety initiatives, so that 2%, any funds received under that 2% portion would go to local public safety initiatives, and then 3% is conditional on CBTs and counties certifying that they've spent their federal allocation, the fiscal recovery funds, which all local units have received. So they need to certify that they've spent those. Those federal funds need to be spent by the end of this calendar year. If they're not, they revert back to the federal government. Any budget's also built on certain revenue adjustments proposed, and the executive recommendation assumes the ones listed here. These can either increase or decrease revenues, and most of the time need a statutory change. So the executive proposes an increase in the landfill tipping fee from 36 cents to $5 per ton. This would increase revenues in Eagle, Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy to about $80 million. In the Labor and Economic Opportunity budget, there is the proposal to receive an early return of some investment money that is currently scheduled to lapse to the general fund in fiscal year 30. However, this statutory change would move the $60 million in the fiscal year 25 budget to support an evergreen fund for capital support for startups. In DNR, there's a move to a recreational passport opt-out, and this would generate about $17 million. And then there's an income tax change dealing with the caregiver tax credit up to $5,000 of caregiver expenses that could be reduced from your income taxes. And this is expected to hit the current year budget by $22.5 million and the 25 budget by $37.5 million. And just the balance sheets basically, put that all together, and I just sum it all up with our look at these both from a general fund and school aid fund perspective for the most recent 3-year period. I would draw your attention, you can't really see unless you get it on the screens, but to the middle column there, that would be the representing fiscal year 25 revenues and expenditures for the exec rec. After it's all said and done, the exec rec will leave about $10.8 million general fund at the close of fiscal year 25 based on current revenue estimates. And in the school aid, the exec rec will leave about $12 million at the close of fiscal year 25. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Ben. No, I appreciate that. Do we have any questions from anyone? And Ben, of course, with the House Fiscal Agency and his counterparts in the Senate Fiscal Agency, are available to all members of the legislature for questions and information on fiscal matters regarding the state and the state budget. They're not just there for members of the Appropriation Committee. So that's important to remember. Sometimes I think that gets lost, that these agencies are open to you all as well. So if there are no questions, I want to thank Ben very much. Appreciate you being here.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Next, as I load up this presentation, hopefully. This morning is a morning of Ben's. For next on our agenda is Ben Frederick. And when I pull up his bio here, so Ben Frederick is currently the Associate Vice President of Advocacy and Government Relations for Memorial Healthcare. In that role, he serves as a liaison at local, state, and federal levels, advocating for public policies that result in improved health care throughout for community, especially underserved and vulnerable populations. Prior to joining Memorial Healthcare, he served as state representative for the 85th House District, which includes his hometown of Owosso. And during that time, he held a number of positions, including Majority Floor Leader. So Ben, if you could come up and talk to these folks about running an office.
Yeah, glad to. Thank you. Good morning. I modified my name tag to be Ben 2 today. I promise there's no numbers in my presentation, so you've gone through a lot of the quantitative with Ben 1. And I'm going to talk a little bit about operations side and just the functioning of an office, and hopefully some tips and tricks of help. First of all, welcome, though I know this is crafted for new staffers, new-ish staffers to the legislature. Welcome to the institution. My own background started over 20 years ago as a constituent services aide for a state representative back in 2002, coming off of a campaign manager role, then policy services for a time with a state representative, chief of staff in the Senate, back to the House for 6 years, state rep myself, majority floor leader, mayor, all these other things. It's been an interesting journey for the last 20 years, but this is a special place. It's a special institution, and I hope you feel that inheritance as you take on these responsibilities in this environment around us, this beautiful Capitol, and the things that just surround this work. So welcome. Job 1 is easily articulated to my mind. It's service. It's service of multiple degrees. Obviously, this is called public service, but offices, first and foremost, are service-delivering entities on behalf of your legislator, be it senator or representative. How many from Senate offices here? Any from Senate? Okay, a couple from the Senate. And House, would be everybody, okay? So I'll be able to mention a few things on the Senate side as well. So here's kind of a baseline. The challenge we have is that expectations regarding government and by connection, our work collectively have never been lower, okay? There's a pretty low expectations right now. But that means that there's an opportunity to exceed those expectations fairly easily through professional conduct and superb constituent services. I have an entirely different presentation just on constituent services alone that Ipswich has been kind enough to facilitate in the past. I can get that to you. We're going to cover that a little bit today. But overall, the work that you do and the way that you present to the constituents is a big opportunity, just given the expectations that they're going to come with being very low when they contact your office. So why a service focus as a primary focus? Perception becomes reality, and politics certainly even more than other sectors. Over time, as you have a reputation one way or the other for delivering good service, that's going to cascade out as far as the member's reputation in your home community. You have an opportunity to engage outside the political context. These individuals are contacting you with needs that may be personal, deeply personal. Navigating state resources, federal facilitation, whatever it might be. Rarely partisan in that type of environment. So you're able to make that personal connection, and your legislator is as well. Relationship building is a natural outcropping of that as there's trust established and follow-up and contact and advocacy on their behalf. And this approach only costs your time as far as being able to engage, listen, and respond to constituents. And, you know, not to be glib, but it's really why we're here. I know there's a lot of other flashy things that maybe get attention from time to time, but the service to constituents, to the people that our bosses are elected to serve, is our primary function. So staff basics, roles, I say people, not furniture. I know I probably am too far gone on the front desk, back desk description, so I kind of had to concede on that one, but at the basis, people roles, legislative aid, constituent services, legislative aid, policy services, And then typically more in the Senate model, that chief of staff, that's a core administrative role. There's more bifurcation of roles in the Senate, such as a floor director, chief of staff, and so on. But those primary roles of constituent services and policy are fairly consistent across both chambers. So just key stuff. I'm not going to go over every bit of this, but constituent aid, big responsibilities. My constituent aid role is that frontline contact for office district. Extremely important. Those of you that are in that frontline role, just recognize that you're the first voice, first contact for your constituency as far as that contact when they're contacting you. You're doing constituent casework management, you're doing schedule management, phone management, daily needs of the office, and other such insignificant things, right? Those are huge, huge tasks. So just recognize those roles that you have, even though this is kind of the entry level, if you will, into that legislative office, you have a critical piece of the success of that office. Coordinating of internships, capital tours and district events, additional opportunities, which is something I like to emphasize. Most of us that were in that policy lead role started with the constituent role. I was no exception. I had a change about 2.5 years into my service. But there is a lot of flexibility, depending on the office, to go into areas of interest where maybe you start to do more in the research or policy side. So there is a nice progression that can happen from that role. Legislative aid, lead staffer, possesses familiarity with the legislative landscape. Typically this person would have prior experience in that lead role. Strategist to and advocate for the member. I mean, that's really that central mindset focus for that legislative aid, that policy director, is to be that advocate. Often entrusted with media relations, those things that would have PR implications, so you as a constituent services would be in constant contact with that lead staffer on things that might have that PR implication. And helping to discern the important versus the unimportant. You probably recognize the flood of stuff that you get all the time. A lot more comes electronically now than it did when I started, but we had a huge pile of stuff that was going in the trash can each week just on scheduling alone, because you have to be so structured in those things. Office administration, often entrusted here. Office budget management, that would include things like district mail plans and so on, and personnel duties. Workflow management, to include all bills, committees, and session. Typically that staffer is the lead on representing the legislator in testimony or whatnot if there's a scheduling conflict. A second set of eyes, so really to be a help to those of you in the constituent aid role on all written correspondence. Over time, that starts to flex down as you get a sense for your legislator's voice and how they respond to things, and you move away from kind of the standardized templates to something that's more representative of what your rep or senator would say, and then it's more of just kind of a case-by-case basis and then interaction. Also represents the member at key district functions, work groups, committee testimony, and so on. So again, very much a lead in that kind of areas of discernment where there's discernment required. There might be PR implications or potential challenges with interactions. This is important. The "not my job" phrase really shouldn't be in the vocabulary of a successful office. I'm not saying that it should be a culture where that's taken advantage of and things keep getting, quote, dumped on people. But the people who are in this office should understand that the mechanics of legislative offices that you've probably seen are not a straight line. They're very much a roller coaster. There's times of extreme slam and there's times of respite. And so everybody should be looking to pitch in and contribute to those tasks, even those things that might be outside of the core job descriptions or maybe mundane from time to time. I've stickered my number of booklets, and it wasn't just when I was in constituent services, you know. Competencies to consider, and they're very important in this work and generally in public service. Professionalism as just an overall concept, how you conduct yourself. We'll talk a little bit about that. Writing and speaking, I can't emphasize this one enough, just communication skills. Writing and speaking well, unfortunately, is a big differentiator now, because it's such a rare skill. So if you're able to hone that type of skill, you really will start to rise to a place where you have other opportunities, where it's noted. And this place of all places should be a place where we do see that level of high quality writing and speaking. Empathy is a critical skill in this business. In just being able to connect with people, to be an active listener, to take on, if you will, some of the things that come at you that have an emotional component, to communicate to individuals that you understand, even when you can't help, that there's been a connection made and that you can see, you know, that where they are and what they're feeling. Advocacy, which is going to be spoken about just a little bit later, as far as being an advocate for your constituents, where you're maybe not dissatisfied with maybe what you get back initially. If you're thinking about things through the lens of, have I done everything I can do potentially to advocate for these individuals? Because you may be the only contact that they have. You may be the only shot that they have. Unfortunately, a lot of constituent weight case comes to us at the last interval. It's not at the beginning. Other things have been tried. It might be a last desperate push, however it is. I wish I could say that's going to change. It's not. It's just the way these things work. Analysis and synthesis, boiling down complex topics to simplistic topics. That's a critical skill to develop, certainly in these early years, which will serve you very well in the research and policy analysis side later as you maybe move into that role or go into that in a specialization. Taking things that have a technical audience in mind and making them available for laypersons. These are very important skills. This could be as simple as speech writing, where you're taking complicated subjects, or maybe you have a legislator that likes to speak in more technical terms and you're doing speech writing that would bring it down to a level where it can be more approachable for an audience back in the district or to a lay audience. Discretion and insight, having just basic instincts about how things are perceived, how they look, how they feel, and building that sense. I say kind of tongue-in-cheek, paranoia is a skill in this business, because the things that really bring down legislative offices as far as effectiveness or even public relations challenges, they're often self-inflicted. They're things that you could see coming a mile away, and there's a point of tension or discomfort that maybe was brushed aside. Develop and trust that instinct as far as some of that discretion. And then organization and workflow management, whether that's a system for phones, constituent feedback, organization just generally of how you do tasks and priorities, those types of things are going to be critical. This is an overarching rule for me, the only contact rule. Treat each phone call, email, input, district conversation as the only time that that person may be not just in touch with your office, but in touch with their government. How many people have you run into in your life, maybe you have this feeling yourself, where there's a cynicism about government? Oftentimes, if you really layer it down, at some point in that person's life, they were vulnerable and they had contact with their government and they were rebuffed or ignored, and it just deeply seated a cynicism. So this might be the only time that that person's reaching out. And if you treat each encounter like that, you really have the best possibility of making a positive impression and perhaps having a relationship formed there with that constituent. So treat each outreach to your office as the only time that constituent will be in contact with your government, their government. You get one shot in effect. That's the mindset to have. Our landscape, I won't go into this in too much detail. People are hurting. Government agencies, elected officials are seen as impersonal and untrustworthy. We as legislative offices get kind of the same broad brush as agencies and other things where there's been more impersonal structures put in place, like a general email box, a 1-800 number. You're part of government, and you have to differentiate through better service, but you're going to have that kind of cautious eye when people are in contact with you. Don't call us, we'll call you. There's a lot of things that really just kind of devalue the contact where the person feels like they're just a number, they're not really going to get individualized service. And remote work shortcomings. There's hazards to remote work as there's benefits to it. And in some cases, I think there's been outsized attention to some of the challenges of remote work as far as the response, nature of response, and what the expectation might be from the public. So professionalism and mindset, kind of a first key concept here. And I'm halfway through already, so I'd love to have some time for questions. I know we're running a little bit long, so I appreciate your diligence here. You are an extension of the legislator at all times. This was tough for me to accept as a 19, 20-year-old when I first started, that I kind of have assumed, in being a legislative staffer, a little bit of that straitjacket of public expectation. Mercifully, I didn't have a social media profile back then. Right? I'm grateful to have been in that generation that didn't have to look back and see what I had to wipe from some formative years in college and high school. These are things you have to think about, though. I didn't expect to be running for the state house 10 years later or 14 years later either when I was a staffer. You don't know how these passions may or interests may, as you continue your work as a legislator, you may say, why not me? You're building a skill set. Think about those things now as far as how you're projecting yourself to employers, to others in that conduct and in your social media profile, whatever it might be. Public trust is always on the line. There's so much scrutiny. It's so easy to create gotcha moments now in politics. You have to have a sense of that personally and in your work every day. I encourage maintaining a degree of formality in interactions. The office does have a certain level of public prestige. It's not an arrogance, it's just a recognition of the fact that there's a professional exchange happening with a constituent and their elected official. And maintain some degree of that formality to help with that process. It creates a certain discipline in the interactions that can go away. Professional manner and appearance is kind of a basic thing. This is a place of business. We have people coming in from all over the state, particularly session days or maybe not session days. So just you consider how you're projecting, again, that legislator's office and yourself as a professional in the state legislature. You can only control how you approach this work. As I mentioned professionalism, you might be thinking of staffers or members that project a different thing than what I'm saying. That's irrelevant. What can you do individually and how you approach this work? I was younger. I will admit I was probably always a little bit more formal or a little bit more cautious on that point because I had more to lose. The young professionals are expected to do things and to screw up and have challenges, and so when you kind of are swimming upstream against those expectations of the younger professional. So just keep that in mind, whether you're a younger professional or not. You can only control how you approach the work. And those behaviors will affect your interactions and opportunities. It's a silent thing, but over time, reputations do get formed in this wider town. It's a small town in a lot of ways. So those things get known as far as how a person's conducting themselves or the level of seriousness that they may be pursuing the work with. So just a caution on that. Organization and time management, there are many good systems. I'm not going to recommend a particular one. The bigger thing is the system has coherence across the positions of your office. Constituent services, policy services, interns, because I do encourage interns to be internships to actually be a robust part of your office. You should really think about how you bring on interns. They shouldn't just be gopher type positions. They should be a true learning experience, which means integration with some of your office workflow. And the representative, often missed, should probably be a participant in your time management and organizational processes. So make sure that that's a conversation that happens. There's a comfort level there. I mentioned the 48-hour response rule. That's pretty standard amongst the private sector customer service facing entities, and it's a great guideline for this work as well, where it's not that you have an answer back within 24 to 40 hours, but there's been some level of reciprocal contact within 24 to 48 hours, acknowledging we have it received and we're going to get more information back, or we're going to be looking for a time to contact you at your convenience. That's not an auto reply either, by the way. That's some type of a personalized response within 48 hours. That auto reply may be able to help on a weekend or in that first 24-hour period, but they need to have some type of individualized thing with their name on it, with its constituent casework in particular, in that 24 to 48 hours. Reciprocate level of personal touch. As that sounds overwhelming, here's a simplification of that concept. Handwritten letters, receive individualized responses. Creative petitions, probably not going to be as individualized as it. So from form to form, reciprocating the form you receive it in helps. If you have a more impersonal form, you can then use more impersonal strategies for how you reply to those things. Personal for personal. And I note here, look for personalization in form emails. It's not just as simple as creating a filter and all those things that have that subject line going in. You got to have that scan going on, whether it's yourself or an intern, saying, are there some that have a personal message to the representative or senator that happen to use an auto form? They can often be missed, and they can come back and bite you if you just send back that auto reply to a form email where there's actually been some things appended. I've seen it where a person just was an older person and they responded, but they had a constituent case inquiry at the bottom of the form message. So just be on the lookout for those things. Schedule management, structure within a system. This is so hugely important. A representative or senator's schedule is like the additional lodger in the attic of the house. It's like another person, and that person gets temperamental and makes demands, and it's a constant balancing act of organization and prioritization. Schedule those staff meetings with the legislator and lead staff. On the Senate side, schedule those meetings with the chief of staff at the very minimum, and the senator if possible, and stick to them. They're often the first thing that's moved, rescheduled, canceled. It doesn't happen in the first place. It's the most kind of disposable. That needs to be prioritized because you're helping them, they're helping you. You're creating coherence across the schedule because sometimes it'd be the legislator attending, sometimes it may be the lead staffer, the chief of staff, whatever it might be. And you have to do that prioritization. You're going to learn the language of that prioritization if you have in your early months, early years, that direct interaction with the legislator to kind of hear their responses to invitations, to hear the lead staffer's guidance in the absence of the member as to how things have been handled in the past. That's very important for you to be able to kind of get a sense for prioritization over time. Prioritization is typically based upon member interest areas as far as the areas that they're kind of really pushing subject matter-wise, committee assignment, district significance. District gets priority if there's a choice. That's almost always the case, right? If there's a choice between a district event or some Lansing event that does not involve constituents qualification. So you ask about constituents, of course, when you have Lansing-based events and you get names of those constituents when they're a part of the visit, and that immediately elevates that importance of that meeting because there's constituents actually present. Involve the team in the process and assign staff coverage respectfully. I say that because it's a work-life balance. So make sure that there's not too much burden on one person or another as far as that district representation, and have a collaborative conversation on that versus just assigning people and maybe causing some stress for yourself and them in the future. Work out the needs for district representation collaboratively, just kind of make sense of that. There should be kind of an understanding between you and your colleagues on staff that if, especially when the session's hot, how is this coverage going to be maintained? There also could be a benefit here for an incumbency program, which is district volunteers, people that you trust that have been empowered to attend on your behalf as volunteers on behalf of the legislator. That's hugely helpful. These are not necessarily paid district workers, but just people that maybe have a background and they enjoy doing an event here and there. I've utilized those in the past myself as a legislator. Extremely helpful. You have that person delivering the tribute who you trust. They have a background or some type of maybe current or former role in local government, perhaps. That helps too. And watch for trip points, active and passive. You may get an innocent invite to something that's not legislative, and you can't address it in that legislative side. It could be innocent. It could be not so innocent, where you're kind of looping in as like an active invitation to something that's going to involve something non-legislative as part of the invitation, and you have to kind of create those boundaries for that. And follow up just as you would with anything else, constituent casework. So you're following up on availability, regrets, RSVPs, and so on. So again, as I said, I have an entire presentation on constituent services. We're just doing some very basic stuff here as we're closing out. So constituent services on the phone, smile on the phone, it's crazy, it works. People can tell, it changes how your tone comes across. Show empathy, get details the first phone call. Like it's labor intensive, but as you're going through casework, just have those things that you know you're gonna need to get that first contact and try to get them in that first conversation. Guide the conversation as you need to, but don't supplant or bring in your own kind of opinions and things to lengthen that conversation. Set parameters on duration if necessary. If you got a long talker, or if you have a frequent flyer type person, you gotta start that conversation with, it's really nice to talk to you again, Bob. I gotta tell you, I've got a meeting at 2 o'clock. Let's say it's 1:50, right? Forgive me, I've got a meeting at 2 o'clock, but I'm glad to talk to you again. What we need to talk about. Then you establish at the beginning of that call your limitation for that contact. Otherwise, you're maybe getting hijacked into a 30, 45-minute listening session. Assume you're being recorded. I hate to add that one at the bottom, but it's a reality. So just assume you're being recorded. This tends to happen more on even-numbered years for some reason, where calls come in that have that potential caution, but just consider that in the calls that you're on. Set clear expectations. This is huge. We will get you an answer, even if it's not the answer we are seeking. Protect yourself. Don't set yourself up for failure here. When you, at the beginning, say, whatever the answer is, and this is what we don't want, we're going to get you an answer. That creates a certain deliverable. And I can tell you, after going through this a number of times, that's respected. Even if it's like, we tried this thing, it didn't work out, but there hasn't been an outward expectation, oh yeah, we're going to fix this for you, we're going to get this done, and then you're letting them down. Because remember, you're not controlling the outcome necessarily from an agency or whatever it is. You're facilitating contact and you're giving the information. I'll need your information, here's how it'll be used, how long it'll be retained. You offer context as to how long responses take. Let me find out versus I don't know, right? This one is important, and it's crept up a lot more in recent years. Don't be passive with people. They'll be in touch with you. We'll see if the department reaches out to you. Call me back in a few days if we don't hear from them. You have to take responsibility for the next step. You do. So whether or not the department calls is irrelevant. When are you going to call back? And it's a non-update call potentially, but they know they're going to hear from you on Friday. This is saving you extra work. How many times you have to deal with those people calling back and checking in to see if we've heard anything. Those are suddenly off your list because they know they're going to hear back from you on Friday, even if you don't have an update. So give yourself that grace and set that expectation at the beginning of the call. Email, similar rules to phone calls. I said smiling optional, but still helps. We'll see about that one. As much as you can pivot these to more personal interactions, the better is kind of the takeaway of this. And consider all emails public record. I know we talk about FOIA and legislature and so on. That's irrelevant. It's in these constituents' hands. There's a theme here on considering things to be public record. You got to do it. You got to treat anything you put out as it could be on the public record, and that should inform how you're communicating with constituents. And again, if you're starting from a professional kind of mindset, you're going to limit your risk on those things. Social media, I really recommend staff managing those things. There's resistance with some members. Keep pushing on that. It's really important. It's not a very good time to value on social media. This should be something that the office monitors, at the very least passively, to see if there's constituent casework that pops out of it, whatever. You're speaking in the voice of the representative. Assume everything you write is immediately turned into a screenshot. I probably shouldn't have to say that one, right? Because we've seen enough of those. So, social media. Again, a few reminders. You speak for the legislator. Mention the legislator as an active participant in the process. I would often throw in Representative so-and-so and I are looking at this. I'm going to talk with the representative or senator tomorrow on this. So it shows that connectivity. And if you at the end of an encounter or constituent case process, it's often a boost for the representative to be able to make that call about a successful outcome and slot that in with tasks that maybe are less pleasurable to do some constituent follow-up calls with them. So I'm being respectful of time here. I want to leave some time for questions, but that was just more on that. I can get this presentation to anybody who would like it. Additional thoughts on involving the legislator. It's important that the legislator has buy-in as far as your process and time. So if you're thinking about Friday, you're going to have a block of time for the legislator to make those follow-up calls. Make sure that is actually happening so that you're not being left with maybe not meeting the expectation of the constituent is the key point there. Advocacy on behalf of your constituent, be courteous to department liaisons, have as much information as needed as possible as first outreach that gets back to the precision with which you're taking the information. Don't just leave it to an email. Try to do follow-up calls with the phone. Time commitments are awesome when you can get them. Organize with other offices. If impediments to service are endemic within a department, this has happened over the years. It's just a reality. It's something to bring up to the legislator if you're seeing a pattern. It's something where the legislator really needs to kind of engage perhaps more directly with their peers even if there's just a kind of a not a response from a particular department on things. You are the advocate for the constituent on behalf of the legislature, so use discernment. Create new email responses. You don't just forward responses from liaisons. That's discouraged generally. But I also don't like the thought process that maybe the answer from the department is just the answer. Make sure that the team is satisfied with that. Maybe you run that past the lead staffer, you run that past the legislator. Are we satisfied with this just being the answer? Or do we want to go after this a little bit more? Maybe we're unsatisfied with that answer. It's common that you may just forward the response, and then in effect, maybe they already got that answer once. The whole point of getting it to you was that they wanted to have a little bit more nuance in the answer than that. So that's where discernment kind of comes in again. A bit on discretion and ethics. I talked about this somewhat. Be respectful of the constituent privacy and sensitive information. You should have a policy as far as retention of social security numbers, case documentation, whether long form or electronic. Share that with individuals as you get their information and then follow it. And obviously don't allow drifting into non-legislative topics in those conversations. It's hard, but you got to keep people moving toward where they need that official help from your office or just interaction on positions. Lobby Corps, no interaction on non-legislative activities on state time or property. Easier or convenient doesn't mean proper or ethical. I can just hand this off to you in the street. Can you come down in 5 minutes? That's convenient. It's also not right. So convenient is not necessarily in alignment with ethical. Just keep that in mind. Be courteous with the lobby corps, but remember, you don't work for them either. So it's not about letting them down or inconveniencing them. You work for the legislator. It's a collaborative process, but you're not a service delivery provider in that way. As I mentioned at the beginning, within yourself, as far as discretion and ethics, know the laws, establish boundaries that you have internally as well, and follow those things. Most of what we see and the tension that forms is when you're not following the boundaries that you've established yourself, and you feel that conflict within yourself as knowing it's just doesn't feel right. Trust your instincts and consult with others. Obviously, there's a number of resources there, whether caucus, nonpartisan, or otherwise external, that can offer some good insights as to those type of situations. Some constituent outreach tips, and then I'll hand it over for any questions. Implement a courtesy follow-up program. Those are just follow-ups to those that have been in contact with your office that are not connected to what they called you about or wrote you about. You're just kind of reaching out to see, if there's further needs. Lamination program, cutting, clipping newspapers. Booklet stations in schools. This is a way to get out your incumbency message. These are typical projects that a constituent aide or frontline staffer would look at, where they're doing a day on the road and they're going to libraries and municipal centers and getting out that legislative update for the incumbent. Constituent contact doors, a similar service provider mindset. Call sheets for the legislator, just to constituents, ask if there are ways that they can help. District volunteers I already touched on, very valuable. Clip and save format in the mail. It's still surprising how many folks of the older population will still have that resource clip and save on their refrigerator. I've seen it when I'm out doing different contact over the years. It still happens. Testimonials, which is a great way to encourage further constituent input, is talking about successful outcomes where people are comfortable that you've already achieved. And then the structuring of meaningful internships that have an actual value add to the office versus a very low value, cyclical kind of nature. So internships can really help. Self-care, very important here. Utilize those support services and mentorship opportunities, whether it's peers, business office offerings, team building. Don't go it alone. It's a weird job. It's a weird environment. A lot of people outside of this work don't understand it. It's very unique. Space out your interactions, particularly if the subject matter is emotional. I mean, that's very true. You can't just slam yourself with 3 difficult calls in the morning and expect to come out of that healthy, frankly. I mentioned before, resolve those ethical dilemmas that you may have tension within quickly, and then hold to those established personal boundaries. And establish places and relationships of safety. You're in the public eye, so you need to have places where you can unwind a bit, and so on. Your brain will find a way to unwind, and it's up to you whether those things are harmful or more helpful. The release is going to happen somewhere if you're feeling tension in this work, and oftentimes if it's not structured in the way you're thinking about it, it comes all at once, and it comes through behaviors that are going to be problematic for you in the future. And prioritize work-life balance. One of the rewards of organized workflow, and I mentioned the no update follow-up, those systems help with that work-life balance. If you have systems in place, you're not getting those extraneous calls or inputs. You can restore some of that work-life balance prioritization. But don't be afraid to schedule personal time. I resisted this a long time. I thought it was in some way kind of demeaning personal time to throw it into a calendar. All that meant is that it wasn't happening, because I wasn't prioritizing it. And I had to kind of knock myself around a little bit and say, no, when I don't put that in the calendar as a block, then it's the first thing gone. So keep those things where, even as a newer staffer, have some time that's personal time. And I know this job isn't necessarily 9 to 5 all the time, but make sure there's areas where it's just that's time for you, and schedule it. So final thoughts: prompt, professional, attentive service with the public trust in mind is the foundation of your legislative work. You can't go wrong as long as that's kind of your central mission. Mindset of service, job one. And your legislator will know in short order whether or not they have a service-oriented office, because they're going to hear that from the constituents that interact with your team, whether they got a response or not. So you're kind of insulating yourself, because eventually that feedback will come through your legislator as well. I listed some resources here, but again, I can get this presentation to those who would wish. I know we're at the end of our time, but I love questions, so if you have any questions now or certainly in the future, I'm glad to do so.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Raphael Johnson, Legislative Director for Senator Santana.
Hello.
And number one, I appreciate the slides. I appreciate the presentation. As an educator, I always find ways to build my repertoire of information and knowledge. And I actually took a couple pictures of your slides, if you don't mind.
Well, thank you, Doctor.
You mentioned ethics, and I was hoping that as you were presenting, I was hoping that you would get into ethical paradigms which is, in my opinion, humble opinion, based on lived experience, is relevant in society. And you just kind of touched on a little bit of ethics. I know we're dealing with legislative office. One of the first books that I read about the realities of politics, I was about 18 years old, was Niccolo de Bernardo Machiavelli, The Prince, and how politics actually work. And I found it interesting how some of those methodologies still are applied today and executed today in politics. But ethical paradigms. You talked about conflict with individuals. Let's be honest, I'm a straight shooter because I'm too old to play games. There's a lot of lying in politics, a lot of trickery, a lot of Machiavellian, a lot of smile on your face, stabbing in your back. Just a lot of that goes on in politics. But people have their different ethics, how they were raised, how their grandmothers raised them, their fathers, their mothers. What happens when how you were raised, conflicts with policy, or conflicts with your boss, conflicts with the norm of things? What happens? What do you do things just to go along to get along? Let's admit, most of the staffers in Lansing are young people, fresh out of college, interns, haven't really lived life, and so they don't have a great value system. They haven't built up those principles and codes of values or codes of honor. So they get tossed into the fire of politics. My question is, what happens if you do have ethical paradigm, it conflicts with everything around you? You love politics, you like your constituents, you like making things happen for the people down in your area, your district, but in politics, ethical paradigm is conflicting.
So I'll start off with an easy question, thank you. No, actually, I've seen that articulated from as simple as a person maybe evolving against their compass and kind of becoming a part of, if you will, what they initially loathed, to even moving away from the sector. It isn't for everybody necessarily. I have seen people get to the point where it's like, I just can't, there's just something within me that I can't make that bridge.
Sure.
But I would throw it back a little bit to you and others is, obviously, with your background too, when I was starting this out, 19, 20 years old, I was extremely kind of blank slate on all of this stuff.
Sure.
I had mentors on both Republican and Democratic side. And I think the seeking of mentorship is one of the things I would very much suggest, because you don't really know what the normative behavior, what the historical legacy is, like what really is extraneous, what is normal, how have we seen things operate in the past, unless you're talking to people that have a certain knowledge legacy, to give you that perspective. I had the good fortune of, again, both sides of the aisle, staffers that were informing me. So I started to have a certain frame of reference on scale, what was possible, what hasn't been possible. Because the challenge is when the idealist hits the realities of the pragmatic and kind of historical trends, there's often that kind of letdown. And I had to early on learn what really was possible in this process versus what would be ideal. And I had to ask myself, am I content with that? Am I content making that difference? Or can I move the ball a little bit this way? Is that enough for me? Mercifully, I wasn't confronted with a core dilemma like an ethical situation where I was working with an employer or something that had kind of questionable situations. Unfortunately, you do confront those things. That's where I say, the establishment of boundaries, some of those universal boundaries are important. My hope is that you're learning, that your eyes are open, and you're seeing. One of the wonderful things about this town is that you have perspectives and representation from all over the state. And there was no better representation of that than being on the House floor as a member and seeing from the UP to Southwest, Southeast, big cities, big, small rural areas, and learning and talking. So participating in things like this where you have that exchange, having the mentorship, having contact across staff offices rather than having every door closed and have that be just kind of a separated unit would be my suggestion. But at some point, I don't have an answer for it for everybody, because it may just be too much of a lift for some. And you find that they do extremely well moving into the nonprofit space or the advocacy space, because you can have a more crystallized, kind of consistent mission that interacts with processes rather than maybe dealing with the compromise that comes with being in those institutions. Other questions? Yeah.
So, obviously you spend a lot of time down here in Lansing, and I would say it's a unique place, as in business. We're working in government, it's kind of separated from everything else. So, transitioning from your time working in the Michigan government to the private sector, how much would you say were you able to carry over from your experience here to the private sector, apart from just the customer service aspect of it?
Well, I think for me, the communications side is again, I can't overstate that. Communicating well has carried over extremely effectively, but also kind of process management where you're looking at a problem you're trying to solve and you see a lot of steps in between you and solving that problem. Translating that to the private sector has been helpful because I have more of a wider view of the public and private implications. And government is in these different parts of the economy. People have opinions about that, agnostic to that, but the reality is you have to have some basic understanding of how these public and private entities interact with each other. So as I'm looking at a policy in the private sector, I'm saying, okay, what types of agencies, what types of elected kind of realities do we need to encounter to make this happen for like a private entity? And then what are the steps that I would need to go through to kind of get that done? It's one of the hardest things to do is turn a bill into a law, right? And so I think for process management, organization, it's carried over extremely well. And then the instinct of just people and personalities, I'm looking for like, where are people coming from? What will be some of the proclivities of a group or an individual that I'm encountering rather than just kind of going in line. Like I'm trying to think about the people side of things. That's carried over well also. Anything else? You got one, Jay? You're the only one left, man. Okay, appreciate it.
Thanks, yeah. Thanks, folks, for hanging out with us. The slides will be available to those who attended and signed up and on our website. Now, I want to thank Ben. He's always made himself available to us with an important session, I think, that we're going to continue evolving over time. So thanks again. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks.